The founding of Rome in 753 BC is one of the most famous stories of antiquity and plays a central role in Roman mythology. According to legend, Romulus and Remus were the sons of Mars, the god of war, and Westerlin Resilvia, a priestess of the fire god Wester. Their grandfather Numitor was the rightful king of Alba Longa, but his brother Amulius had overthrown him and seized the throne to prevent Numitor's descendants from reclaiming his claim to the throne. Amulius forced Resilvia Bema Westerlin so that she would live in celibacy and have no children. Nevertheless, she became pregnant, and when Amulius learned of the twins, he had them abandoned to die. Legend has it that Romulus and Remus were abandoned in a willow basket on the banks of the Tiber. But instead of dying, they were found by a she-wolf who suckled them. Later, the shepherd Faustulus took the children in and raised them with his wife Erlorenti. The brothers grew up to be strong and courageous young men and became leaders of a group of shepherds and outcasts. When they finally learned of their true origins, they turned against Amulius, overthrew him, and restored their grandfather Numitor as king. They then decided to found their own city to create a new home for their followers. However, when it came to choosing a location, a dispute arose. Romulus preferred the Palatine Hill, while Remus preferred the Aventine. To make a decision, they decided to ask the gods for an omen. Romulus saw 6 vultures, but shortly afterwards, Romulus saw 12. This was interpreted as a sign that the gods favored Romulus. But the dispute remained. In a moment of rage, Romulus is said to have killed his brother after he mocked the city walls that Romulus had built. Rome was named after its founder, Romulus. After founding Rome, Romulus organized the city and created the first social structures. He is said to have enacted the first laws and divided the population into different groups. Since the city initially consisted only of men, Romulus is said to have initiated the so-called rape of the Sabine women, in which women were kidnapped from the neighboring Sabines to increase the Chivdebais, to increase the Bonant women, in which women were kidnapped from the neighboring Sabines to increase the Supresnevans to Durines, the so-called rape of the Sabine women, in which women were kidnapped from the Nishabine women, in which nabbed from the nabbed for Prince the Sinmaim. The population of Rome. This led to a war with the Sabines, which was finally ended by a compromise in which Sabines accepted union with the Romans, and Rome was further strengthened. While the mythical tale of Romulus and Remus was regarded as historical truth for many centuries, archaeological finds show that small settlements already existed on the hills of what would later become Rome in the 8th century BC. These settlements consisted of simple straw-covered huts and probably belonged to a Latin or Etruscan community. The region of Latium, where Rome was located, was a cultural center where influences from various peoples, including the Etruscans, Sabines, and Greeks, mingled. Early Roman society was strongly agrarian, and the first rulers were probably tribal leaders who ruled over small communities. Roman royal period. The Roman royal period began with the legendary founding of Rome in 753 BC by Romulus, who became the first king of Rome. Romulus laid the foundations for Roman society by first gathering a group of companions around him, who formed the basis of the Roman population. To further populate Rome, he invited men from the neighboring regions and carried out the famous abduction of the Sabine women to gain women for his settlement. This early phase of Rome was marked by military conflicts and territorial expansion. The second king, Numa Pompilius, took over after Romulus' death and introduced a series of religious reforms. Numa is considered the one who established many of the religious rituals and institutions that shaped Roman life for centuries. Under his rule, a peaceful period that served to strengthen religious and legal organization. The third king, Tullus Hostilius, was a warlike ruler who was known for leading Rome into numerous military conflicts in order to enlarge the city and expand its power. He conquered the neighboring cities of Alba Longa and other parts of Latium, thereby significantly expanding Rome's territory. The fourth king, Ancus Matius, continued the expansion by founding the port of Ostia, thereby strengthening Rome's trade relations. He also contributed to the consolidation of Roman power both militarily and economically. The fifth king, Tarquinius Priscus, placed first Etruscan on the Roman throne and carried out important infrastructural improvements. Under his rule, the first major construction projects were carried out, such as the construction of the Cloaca Maxima, one of the oldest sewer systems in the world, and the expansion of the Roman city walls were realized. However, his reign was also marked by conflicts with the Roman aristocracy. The sixth king, Servius Tullius, also implemented significant reforms, including the introduction of a census and a restructuring the Roman army, which led to the creation of a military system that was to form the basis for Roman expansion. He also introduced the Servian Wall, which protected Rome from external threats. The seventh and last king of Rome was Tarquinius Superbus. Under his rule, the Kingdom of Rome became one of the most powerful cities in Italy, but he also implemented authoritarian moves and came into conflict with the aristocracy. Titus Superbus' tyranny eventually led to his expulsion. The spark that ignited the fall of the monarchy was the event when his daughter Lucretia was raped by the royal son Sextus Tacitus, which led to a rebellion that resulted in the deposition of the last monarch and the founding of the Roman Republic in 509 BC. The Roman monarchy ended with the fall of Thellus King, and from then on Rome was governed as a republic, with a balanced distribution of power between the various institutions, such as the Senate, the consuls, and the popular assemblies. Introduction of the Republic after the fall of the last Roman king, Tarquinius Superbus, in 509 BC, the Roman Republic was founded. The Republic was based on the idea that no individual should have absolute power, but that rule was distributed among various offices and institutions. The most important political offices in the Republic were the consuls, of whom there were usually two in office at the same time, who held the highest military and administrative powers within the Republic. Their term of office was limited to 1 year, which ensured a certain degree of control and accountability. The Senate, an assembly of experienced and wealthy citizens, also played a central role in the Roman Republic. It was originally an advisory body, but gradually gained power and influence, especially in matters of foreign policy and legislation. The Senate represented the interests of the ruling upper class, the patricians, and played a decisive role in shaping Roman policy. However, the Roman Republic wasn't only shaped by the consuls and the Senate. There was also a system of popular assemblies in which Roman citizens, especially the plebeians, could participate in political decisions. Over time, the plebeians gained more political rights through struggles and social movements, making the Republic an increasingly inclusive political structure. Another important aspect of the Roman Republic was the legal system. Roman laws, especially the 12 Tables, which was formulated in 451 BC, formed the basis for Roman law and later influenced the legal systems of many European countries. This law was a collection of rules and regulations that governed the public and private lives of the Romans and protected citizens from arbitrary justice. Overall, the founding of the Roman Republic was a significant step in the political development of Rome. The Republic enabled the Roman people to govern themselves and laid the foundation for the later expansion and rise of the Roman Empire. However, despite the successes of the Republican system, it was marked from the outset by tensions between the different social classes and political institutions, which ultimately led to the fall of the Republic and the emergence of the Roman Empire. Class struggles. the class struggles that took place between the 5th century became a series of social and political conflicts between the two most important social groups in ancient Rome, the patricians and the plebeians. The patricians were the aristocratic upper class who originally held political and religious power in Rome, while the plebeians made up the common population, who were considered free citizens but were politically and legally disadvantaged. At the beginning of the Roman Republic, the patricians held almost all important offices and privileged positions. They controlled the consulates, the military leadership, and the Senate. The plebeians had little influence in political decisions and were heavily dependent on the patricians. In the early centuries of the Republic, the plebeians attempted to improve their political power and social position by fighting against the supremacy of the patricians. The first significant conflict took place 49 BC, when the plebeians, in a kind of popular uprising, known as the Sextus Plebis, left the city of Rome and gathered on the Mons Aetato, demand political change. At that moment, the patricians began to make concessions to the plebeians, and a series of reforms were introduced that changed the balance of power between the two groups. One of the first major achievements of the plebeians was the introduction of the office of tribune of the plebs. These magistrates were created specifically to represent the interests of the plebeians and protect their rights against the machinations of the patricians. The tribunes of the plebs had the right to block laws and raise objections against decisions made by the ruling class. However, the most significant reform to emerge from the class struggle was the 12 Tables, which were passed in 451 BC. This law was a written collection of rules and regulations governing daily life and legal relationships in Rome. The 12 Tables were a milestone in Roman legal history, as they were binding on all citizens, both patricians and plebeians, and codified the existing legal norms. They ensured a certain legal equality for the plebeians and prevented them from continuing to be disadvantaged by the arbitrary iteration of laws. The class struggles continued in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, when the plebeians gradually gained further political and economic rights. Over time, they were able to extend their political power through various legal reforms, such as the Lex Hortensia of 287 BC, which declared the decisions of the People's Assembly as binding for all Roman citizens, further expanding their political power. This ultimately led to extensive equality between the two social groups. Even though the patricians continued to hold important social and political positions. Men. After conquering Italy in the 4th and 3rd centuries BC, Rome experienced a phase of intense expansion in which the city extended its influence over the entire Italian peninsula. These conquests were the result of a combination of military strength, strategic alliances, and the ability to integrate the subjugated peoples into the Roman system. Roman expansion in Italy began with conflicts with neighboring tribes and peoples, who settled in the regions around Rome and eventually led to Rome's domination over all of Italy. At the beginning of the 4th century, Rome was still competing with other Italian peoples, including the Etruscans in the north, the Samnites in the south, and the Greeks in southern Italy. At first, the Roman Republic was marked by internal conflicts and the struggle for political equality within its own society. But during this period, Rome repeatedly engaged in military conflicts that expanded its territory. A key moment in this phase of expansion was the war against the Samnites, a tribal people native to southern Italy. The Samnites fought several wars against Rome, known as the Samnite Wars from 343 to 290 BC, which were decisive for the expansion of Roman power to southern Italy. In these wars, Rome was able to prove its military superiority and defeat the Samnites, which laid the foundation for the later integration of southern Italy into the Roman Empire. Rome also formed a series of alliances with other peoples in the region, which strengthened its position and facilitated the expansion of its rule. In the years following the Samnite Wars, Rome continued its expansion and was also able to bring the cities and regions of the Etruscan north and the Greek colonies in the south under its control. A striking example of this was the conquest of the Etruscan city of Veii in 396 BC, which is considered one of the most important victories of Rome during this period. Control over Veii and other Etruscan cities strengthened Rome's position in central Italy and secured Rome's control over trade routes and important resources. Rome also proceeded skillfully to minimize resistance from the subjugated peoples. After Rome had defeated cities and peoples, it offered them either Roman citizenship or the so-called confederation system, which allowed the subjugated peoples a certain degree of autonomy, but at the same time ensured their loyalty to Rome. This system enabled Rome to expand its military and political control without constantly being involved in conflicts with the local peoples. A decisive event that paved the way for complete control of the Italian peninsula was the war against the Macedonian Empire and Hellas in the 3rd century BC, which was triggered by Rome's increasing expansion into the Mediterranean region. The so-called Pyrrhus War from 280 to 275 BC Christ against Pyrrhus of Epirus demonstrated Rome's growing military strength and led to the conquest of Greek southern Italy. It was a remarkable victory for Rome, as it faced a stronger opponent whose armies were among the best of the time. By the end of the 3rd century BC, Rome had conquered virtually all of Italy with the exception of a few mountainous areas. Roman expansion was largely complete at this point, and Rome began to extend its resources and military power to the Mediterranean region. This expansion of Roman rule to the entire Italian peninsula was not only a military success but also a political achievement that paved the way for Rome to become one of the most powerful and significant civilizations of ancient times. Become one of the most powerful and significant civilizations of the ancient world. The integration of the various Italic peoples into the Roman system promoted the creation of a unified Roman state and contributed to the emergence of a common identity based on Roman values and institutions. This process of conquest and integration made Rome a dominant power in Italy and laid the foundation for its later expansion throughout the Mediterranean region. First Punic War. The First Punic War from 64 BC was a significant military conflict between Rome and Carthage for supremacy in the western Mediterranean. The war began as a dispute over control of the island of Sicily between the two great powers. The immediate cause of the war was Rome's support for the city of Messana, which had been occupied by mercenaries known as the Mamertines. Messana asked both Rome and Carthage for help because it felt threatened. Rome, which at that time did not yet have a major military presence in the Mediterranean, saw this as an opportunity to expand its influence in the region. Rome decided to support Messana, which angered the Carthaginians because they already had considerable influence in Sicily. The Carthaginians responded by declaring war on Rome, marking the beginning of the First Punic War. At the beginning of the Dacian War, Rome had little experience in naval warfare, while Carthage possessed a strong and experienced naval force. Nevertheless, the Romans managed to build their own navy and successfully hold their own against the Carthaginians. Particularly noteworthy was the development of the corvus, an innovative war machine that enabled the Romans to board ships and engage in close combat, which benefited the Roman forces as they were already well trained in land combat. In 260 BC, the Romans won their first significant victory in the Battle of Mulli, defeating the Carthaginian fleet. Although Carthage initially retained control of the sea, Rome increasingly gained the upper hand in the fighting. The war dragged on for several years, with numerous naval battles and land battles in which control of Sicily changed hands repeatedly between the two powers. A decisive turning point in the war was the Battle of Ecnomus in 256 BC, in which the Roman fleet won one of the greatest naval victories of antiquity. Despite this victory, the Romans were unable to completely defeat the Carthaginians. The war finally ended in 241 BC, another Roman victory in the Battle of the Egadian Islands, forcing Carthage to sign a peace treaty, the Treaty of Cannae. Caecilianus ended the First Punic War and laid down the terms of peace. Carthage had to cede Sicily to Rome and recognize the island as the first Roman province. In addition, Carthage had to pay heavy war reparations and significantly reduce its fleet. This defeat weakened Carthage politically and economically, while Rome's victory not only secured its control over Sicily but also expanded its influence in the western Mediterranean. The loss of Sicily and their reparations payments weighed heavily on Carthage in the long term, although it recovered relatively quickly from the defeat. This victory marked the beginning of Rome's expansion and its rise to become the dominant power in the western Mediterranean. Rome benefited from its control over Sicily, which became an important base for further military campaigns. However, this expansion led to tensions between Rome and Carthage, which later erupted in the Second Punic War. Second Punic War, the Second Punic War, the Second Punic War, which lasted until 146 BC, was the second major military conflict between Rome and Carthage. The war began when the Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca declared war on Rome. In 218 BC, after Rome broke a treaty that was supposed to maintain the status quo in the western Mediterranean region. The conflict led to a series of battles that were fought both on land and at sea, and was considered one of the most intense and far-reaching wars of the ancient Mediterranean. The war quickly took a dramatic turn when Hannibal, with an impressive strategy, began to challenge Rome in an unexpected way. Instead of taking the direct route across the Mediterranean, he decided to march across the Alps to Italy with an army of about 9,000 cavalrymen and 37 war elephants to march across the Alps to Italy. This daring and extraordinary Alpine crossing was a strategic masterpiece that surprised Rome and the rest of the ancient world, and at the same time represents one of the most remarkable military maneuvers in history. Hannibal's army suffered many losses on its way through the Alps, but the field tactician, after reaching Italy, began to confront the Roman troops with surprise attacks and achieved a series of remarkable victories, the most famous of which was the Battle of Cannae in 216 BC, in which Hannibal completely destroyed a Roman army of around 80,000 men. This battle is considered one of the greatest tactical defeats in military history and plunged Rome into a serious crisis. Many Roman soldiers and high-ranking officers fell, and the Roman population was deeply shaken. Hannibal's victory was not only a military triumph but also a psychological blow to Roman power that called the entire Roman Republic into question. Despite Hannibal's enormous military successes, Catiline was unable to fully implement the strategic objectives of the war. While Hannibal continued to operate in Italy and defeated the Roman troops on various occasions. However, he was unable to capture the Roman capital and defeat the Republic once and for all. Rome, recovering from its losses, changed its military strategy and, under the command of Publius Cornelius Scipio, Rome sought new allies in Italy and was finally able to regain control of the region. Scipio led an attack on Carthage to prevent Hannibal from returning home and reorganizing his troops. In 202 BC, the two armies met in the Battle of Zama near the city of Carthage. In this decisive battle, Scipio defeated Hannibal decisively by using a tactic that neutralized Hannibal's movements and those of his elephants. This victory gave Rome the final upper hand in the war. After the defeat at Zama, Carthage had to sign a peace treaty with Rome that ended the Second Punic. The terms of the peace treaty were harsh. Carthage to surrender its fleet, give up its territories in Africa and Spain, and pay heavy compensation. to Rome. In addition, Carthage was severely restricted in its military and economic activities. The Treaty of Zama secured Rome's supremacy in the Western Mediterranean, made the Republic the dominant power in the region. Third Punic War. The Third Punic War, which lasted until 146 BC, was the last and decisive conflict between Rome and Carthage, resulting in the final destruction of the Carthaginian city and the conversion of its territory into a Roman province. This war was the result of the long-standing rivalry between Thetal powers, which had repeatedly clashed since the First Punic War from 64 to 141 BC, and the Second Punic War from 118 to 201 BC. Although Carthage had signed a peace treaty after its defeat in the Second Punic and severely restricted in its military and economic capabilities, the hatred between Rome and Carthage remained. Rome's drive for growth and Carthage's efforts to recover economically intensified the tensions, and the Third Punic War would ultimately answer the question of which of the two powers would gain undisputed supremacy in the Western Mediterranean. The trigger for the war was the growing dissatisfaction in Rome with Carthage's increasing economic and military recovery despite the provisions of the Peace Treaty of Samos, which severely restricted Carthage, particularly the fact that Carthage, which was no longer allowed to have its own army after the Second Punic War, was increasingly regenerating itself militarily alarmed. Rome. The immediate trigger for the war was a conflict in Carthage with its neighbors in present-day Tunisia. Rome used these disputes as a pretext to attack Carthage. Even though the city hadn't its best in the past to comply with the Treaty of Zama and had no military ambitions, the Roman leadership under the consul Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, a grandson of the famous Scipio Africanus, saw the destruction of Carthage an opportunity to secure Roman supremacy once and for all and end the conflict once and for all. Rome declared war on Carthage, and the Third Punic War began in 149 BC. The war began with a siege of Carthage, during which Rome attempted to starve and conquer the city through a siege lasting several years each ring. The Carthaginians, although their military strength was considerably weakened, defended their city bravely. They erected a series of defensive structures and were even able to achieve minor successes against the Roman attackers in the first years of the siege. However, Rome relied on a strategy of complete annihilation, and under the leadership of Scipio Aemilianus, the Roman troops increasingly concentrated on blockading the city and using siege weapons. After Carthago had withstood several years of siege, Rome was finally able to conquer the city in 146 BC. The siege was carried out with extraordinary violence and brutality. After the city fell, Scipio Aemilianus ordered the complete destruction of Carthage. The city was burned to the ground, its walls and buildings destroyed, and many of the surviving Carthaginians were enslaved or killed. It is reported that the destruction was so extensive that the city subsequently disappeared from the map and was never rebuilt. The Third Punic War had far-reaching consequences for the Western Mediterranean and the Roman Empire. First of all, the destruction of Carthage marked the definitive end of the Punic threat and secured Rome's unchallenged dominion over the Western Mediterranean. The entire territory of Carthago, including North Africa, was incorporated into the Roman province of Africa. Rome's expansion and influence in the region increased significantly, and the war contributed to the merging supremacy of Rome in the ancient world. With the conquest of Greece, the Roman victory over the Greek states and Macedonia in 146 BC led to the transformation of Greece into the Roman province of Achaia. However, the process of Roman expansion in Greece did not begin abruptly in 146 BC, but was the result of years of tension and military conflicts between Rome and the Greek states. Since 200 BC, Rome had increasingly exerted influence over the Greek cities and kingdoms. Rome initially intervened in the tensions and military conflicts between Rome and the Greek states since the 200 years before Christ. Rome had increasingly exerted influence over the Greek cities and kingdoms. Initially, Rome intervened in Greece's internal conflicts and supported various Greek cities in their political struggles against rival powers such as the Macedonian Empire. This led to Rome becoming increasingly involved in Greek affairs, which intensified the mistrust and tensions between the Roman and Greek leaders. The decisive turning point in this conflict was the Third Macedonian War from 171 to 168 BC, which ended with Rome's victory over the Macedonian Empire under King Perses. After this victory, Macedonia became a Roman province in 146 BC, and Rome's power base in the Greek region was significantly strengthened. However, even the Greek states, which were involved in political and military conflicts as city-states, began to increasingly feel Roman control. Rome's direct advance into Greece came in 146 BC, when the Greek city of Corinth, which had rebelled against Roman hegemony, was defeated in a last desperate resistance by Roman troops under the consul Lucius Mummius. The victory over Corinth was not only a military victory, but also a symbolic act. Corinth was one of the most famous cities in Greece and was considered a cultural and economic center. The destruction of Corinth by the Romans marked the definitive end of Greek independence and ushered in the complete integration of Greece into the Roman Empire. After the destruction of Corinth and the victory over the Greek cities, Rome decided to officially make Greece a province. The Roman province of Achaia, named after the region, was founded and was henceforth under Roman control. The province encompassed the entire Greek mainland, and the Roman administration took control of the resources and political organization of the region. Although Greece formally became part of the Roman Empire, it retained a certain degree of autonomy, particularly in cultural aspects. Many Greek traditions, philosophies, and arts continued to find their place within the Roman Empire, which led to Greek culture and heritage exerting a lasting influence on Roman society. The Roman victory over Greece had not only political and military implications, but also cultural ones. The Greeks, who at that time, as the cultural and intellectual center of the Western world, exerted a profound influence on the Roman elite. Many Roman citizens and politicians entered Greek philosophy, art, and literature and began to integrate Greek ideas into their own political and social structures. Roman architecture and art were also inspired by Greek models, leading to a fusion of the two cultures. Greece, now officially part of the Roman Empire, experienced a period of cultural flourishing under Roman rule, particularly in fields of philosophy and the arts. Greek culture continued to find fertile ground within the Roman Empire, even though Rome retained political supremacy. In general, the conquest of Greece represented an important moment in the history of Rome, as it not only symbolized the military success and expansion of the Roman Empire but also integrated the heritage and ideas of one of the greatest civilizations of antiquity into the Roman Empire. However, Roman control over Greece was not without challenges. In the years following the conquest, there were various rebellions and revolts as many Greeks continued to try to preserve their independence. However, these attempts were unsuccessful and Greece remained under the rule of the Roman Empire. Even though Greece lost its political independence, it remained an important part of the Western world and continued to influence Roman society and culture. Reforms of the Gracchi, the brothers Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, both from a distinguished plebeian family, attempted between 133 and 121 BC AD to reduce growing social inequality and reshape the balance of power in the Roman state. However, their political activities led to fierce conflicts with the conservative upper class. especially with the Senate, which ultimately led to their violent deaths and increasing political radicalization within Rome. Tiberius Gracchus, the older of the two brothers, was elected tribune of the people in 03 BC. He recognized that one of the greatest social challenges facing the Republic was the growing gap between the wealthy upper class and the impoverished population, especially the peasantry, who suffered from the consequences of Roman expansion. Large latifundia, or huge estates owned by wealthy senators and nobles. Many small farmers lost their land and were forced to move to the cities, where they often lived in poverty. To resolve this crisis, Tiberius Gracchus proposed a comprehensive land reform. His law, known as the Lex Sempronia Agraria, provided for the redistribution of state land that had previously been illegally occupied by the elite to landless citizens. The aim was to restore the peasantry and thus ensure Rome's economic and military stability. The Senate, which consisted mainly of wealthy landowners, put up fierce resistance to this reform because it threatened their own economic interests. When Tiberius Gracchus nevertheless wanted to push through his reform with the support of the People's Assembly, the conflict escalated. The Senate considered his action a violation of the Constitution and a threat to the existing balance of power. Finally, Tiberius Gracchus, along with many of his followers, was killed in 133 BC in a violent attack by senatorial forces. After his brother's death, Gaius Gracchus continued the reform movement when he 123 BC. He not only continued his brother's land reforms, but also expanded his reform plans to include additional measures to strengthen the plebeians. These included a law on subsidized grain supply for the urban population, the construction of new colonies for the settlement of landless citizens, and reforms in the judicial system that were intended to limit the influence of the Senate. He also attempted to strengthen the alliance between the plebeians and the Roman equites, a wealthy non-senatorial class, in order to create a counterweight to the conservative Senate. His opponents in the Senate feared a loss of power and used every opportunity to discredit him. After Gaius ran for a third term as tribune of the plebs in 121 BC, tribune of the people in 121 BC, unrest broke out in the city, which the Senate used as an opportunity to pass the so-called Senatus Consultum Ultimum, a declaration of emergency that allowed violence to be used against political opponents. In the ensuing conflicts, Gaius Gracchus was persecuted by his political enemies and eventually committed suicide to avoid capture. Hundreds of his followers were also killed or executed. Rise of Gaius Marius between the years and BC. Gaius Marius succeeded in fundamentally changing both his own power and the role of the Roman army. Through comprehensive military reforms and a clever political strategy. Marius came from a rather modest family in Arpinum, far from traditional Roman elite, but nevertheless succeeded in rising to the highest offices through militarices and populist politics to rise to the highest offices. His most significant political breakthrough came in 107 BC when he was elected consul for the first time. Consul. At that time, Rome was fighting a difficult war against North African kingdom of Numidia under King Jugurtha. Marius took command and waged the war with a determined and effective strategy. Finally, one of his officers, Lucius Cornelius Sulla, managed to capture Jugurthane Arus, which ended the war and brought Marius enormous fame. However, the real historical significance of Gaius Marius lay in his military reforms. Before his time, the Roman army consisted mainly of citizens who had a certain minimum amount of wealth and had to pay for their own equipment. This meant that many poorer citizens were excluded from military service. This fundamentally changed this system by opening up army recruitment to propertyless citizens and obliging the state to provide equipment. This led to the creation of the first standing professional army, which was no longer compassed wealthy citizens, but increasingly of landless proletarians. These reforms made the Roman army more flexible and powerful, but also had far-reaching political consequences, as these soldiers were now directly dependent on their generals, and a close bond developed between leaders and their troops. Instead of being loyal to the state, Manolegionaries felt primarily loyal to their commander. This was to lead to major internal conflicts in the coming decades, as ambitious military leaders used their troops to fight political power struggles. Marius' reforms proved their worth in the following years when Rome was confronted with the threat of the Cimbri and Teutons. These Germanic tribes had defeated Roman armies in several battles and marched through Gaul and Italy between 104 and 1 BC. Marius was elected consul 5 times in a row, an extraordinary event in Roman history. In a series of campaigns, he decisively defeated the Germanic invaders, particularly in the Battle of Acquiane, 202 BC, and the Battle of Vercellae in 2011 BC. After these military successes, however, Marius became increasingly embroiled in political conflicts. His alliance with populist politicians led to violent clashes with the senatorial aristocracy, Music. In the century BC, he became involved in domestic violence when his allies wanted to push through radical reforms. The situation escalated and Marius was forced to distance himself from his own supporters, which led to his political influence declining in the following years. Dictatorship of Sulla. Lucius Cornelius Sulla, one of the most influential figures in the late Roman Republic, began his reign as dictator in 07 BC. This marked a turning point in Roman history, as he took unprecedented measures to secure his power and reshape the political order according to his own ideas. His reign became particularly notorious for the so-called proscriptions, a brutal purge with which he eliminated his political enemies. Sulla came from an old but impoverished patrician family and rose to the highest offices through his military successes and political skill. His career was closely associated with Gaius Marius, who employed him as an officer during the Jugobit War. However, the two men became bitter rivals when Sulla, in the 80s BC, took a leading role in the political conflicts of the Republic. The trigger for his coup d'etat was a power struggle for command in the war against Mithridates VI of Pontus. Sulla was originally intended to be commander-in-chief, but the Senate withdrew his command in favor of a supporter of Marius. Sulla then marched on Rome with his legions, an unprecedented act in the history of the Republic, and forced his reinstatement to office. After briefly bringing Rome under his control, he moved to Theus to wage war against Mithridates. While Sulla was away, his opponents, led by Marius and his allies, gained control of Rome. Marius returned from exile and had many of Sulla's supporters executed. But after Sulla in the east, he returned to Italy with his troops in 83 BC. In a bloody civil war, he defeated the troops of the populares and conquered Rome once again. After his victory, Sulla had himself appointed dictator in 08 BC, but with almost unlimited powers, he initiated a massive political purge known as the proscriptions. Lists with the names of his opponents were published, and anyone on the list could be killed with impunity. The victims' possessions were confiscated and distributed to Sulla's followers. Thousands of senators, knights, and ordinary citizens fell victim to these purges, while Sulla consolidated his control over the state. In addition to the proscriptions, Sulla carried out far-reaching reforms aimed at strengthening the power of the Senate and drastically limiting that of the tribunes of the people. He increased the number of senators, weakened the influence of the People's Assembly, and laid down strict rules for holding political office. His reforms were an attempt to stabilize the Republic and prevent future political upheavals. Surprisingly, Sulla voluntarily resigned from office in 79 BC and retired to his estate, where he died in 78 BC. His withdrawal from politics was unusual for a man who had come to power with such violence. But despite his reforms, he was unable to prevent the further decline of the Republic. His actions had shown that military force was an effective means of gaining power in Rome, a lesson that latter generals, such as Gaius Julius Caesar, understood only too well. First Triumvirate. The First Triumvirate was an unofficial alliance between three of the most powerful men in Rome: Gaius Julius Caesar, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, and Marcus Licinius Crassus. It was formed in 01 BC to secure the political and military interests of the three men and expand their power within the Roman Republic. Although it was not an officially recognized state body, this alliance had a significant influence on Roman politics and paved the way for the latter downfall of the Republic. Julius Caesar was at that time an up-and-coming politician who had secured the support of the people but did not yet have the military power to fully realize his ambitions. Pompey was one of Rome's most respected generals, who enjoyed great prestige, thanks to his successful campaigns in the East, but had difficulty providing his veterans with land. It was striking that the richest men in Rome had enormous financial resources, but did not have the same military prestige as Pompey or Caesar. The three men realized that they could compensate for their respective weaknesses by forming an alliance. Pompey wanted to supply his troops and have his eastern settlements confirmed. Caesar sought military glory and needed support for his political ambitions, especially for his desired consulate. Together, they overruled the Senate and decided to unite their power. Through the triumvirate, Caesar succeeded in being elected consul. In 59 BC, during his term in office, he implemented reforms that benefited Pompey and Crassus, including the confirmation of Pompey's settlement policy in the East and economic relief for Crassus and his supporters. In return, Caesar was given command of the provinces of Gaul Cisalpina, Gaul Narbonensis, and Ilium for 5 years, which gave him the opportunity to begin his famous conquests in Gaul. However, the alliance was unstable from the outset, as the three men pursued their own strong interests to strengthen their ties. Pompey married Caesar's daughter Julia, which temporarily brought them closer together. But tensions soon began to arise, especially between Pompey and Crassus. In 56 BC, the three men met in the city of Lucca to renew their alliance. They agreed that Caesar should extend his governorship in Gaul, while Pompey and Crassus jointly ran for the consulate in the year BC. After their successful election, Pompey received the provinces of Hispania, while Crassus took command of Syriato, waged war against the Parthian Empire. The end of the triumvirate began with the death of Crassus in 53 BC, after he suffered a crushing defeat in the Battle of Car against the Per. Without the balancing influence of Crassus, the relationship between Pompey and Caesar deteriorated rapidly. Another serious blow to the alliance was the death of Julia in BC, which severed the family ties between Caesar and Pompey. In the years that followed, Pompey increasingly became an ally of Senate, while Caesar grew more powerful through his conquests in Gaul. Finally, the growing rivalry between the two led to the outbreak of a civil war in 49 BC, when Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his troops and marched against Pompey, thus ending the first triumvirate, and the last years of the Republic were numbered. Caesar's Gallic War. Julius Caesar's Gallic War was a series of military campaigns that took place between 50 BC and 44 BC. During these years, Caesar led the Roman legions against the Celtic tribes of Gaul and conquered large parts of what is now France, Belgium, and Switzerland. The conquest of Gaul was one of the most significant military undertakings in Roman history and had far-reaching consequences for both Caesar's political career and the spread of Roman culture. Consequences. Caesar's main goal was initially to protect the Roman provinces in southern Gaul from enemy tribes, but he soon seized the opportunity to expand his sphere of influence. His first campaign began in 58 BC against the Helvetians, a Celtic people who wanted Taoist Caesar defeated them in the Battle of Bybactis and prevented their resettlement. In the same year, he turned against the Germanic prince Ariovistus, who wanted to establish himself in Gaul. After a successful victory, he secured Rome's influence over the area. In the following years, Caesar continued his conquests, defeating the Belgae in the north and subjugating the Celtic tribes in the west. He became particularly famous for his campaign against the Veneti, a seafaring people on the Atlantic coast, who defended themselves against Rome with a strong fleet through a clever combination of military tactics and diplomatic skill. Caesar succeeded in bringing Gaul under Roman control piece by piece. To further increase his fame, Caesar undertook two expeditions beyond the borders of Gaul. In 56 BC, he set sail with his legions for Britain to subjugate the tribes there. Although he did not achieve lasting success in his conquest, he left a strong impression. In 50 BC, he crossed the Rhine and led a short campaign against Germanic tribes before retreating back to Gaul. The Gallic tribes put up fierce resistance, but were often divided among themselves. The last major uprising against Roman rule was led by Vercingetorix, a charismatic leader of the Arverni. In 52 BC, he united numerous Gallic tribes and confronted Caesar in several battles. The decisive moment came in the Siege of Alesia, where Caesar skillfully outmaneuvered the Gallic troops and forced them to surrender. Vercingetorix was captured and later executed in Rome. With the victory over the Gauls, the entire territory was finally in Roman hands. The conquest of Gaul not only brought Caesar enormous wealth and a loyal result, but also political fame and position in Rome. At the same time, Gaul was integrated into the Roman Empire, spreading Roman culture, administration, and economy throughout the region. The Gallic War made Caesar one of the most powerful men in Rome, which ultimately led to conflict with the Senate and civil war. His detailed reports on the campaigns he recorded in the work De Bello Gallica are still one of the most important sources of Roman history and demonstrate not only his military skills but also his political propaganda. Civil war between Caesar and Pompey. The civil war between Gaius Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompey Magnus was a decisive conflict in the late Roman Republic that lasted from 49 to 45 BC. The war was triggered by growing tensions between Caesar, who had achieved immense military successes in Gaul, and the Senate, which was supported by Pompey. The conflict began when the Senate demanded that Caesar dismiss his legions and return to Rome. This demand was a direct threat to his political position and personal safety, as his opponents were presumably preparing charges against him. Instead, Caesar decided to cross the Rubicon with his troops, the symbolic border between his province and the actual Roman territory. This happened in January 49 BC and marked an open break with the Senate. Pompey and many senators fled from Rome to Greece to raise an army. Caesar, however, marched unhindered into the capital and took control. He then began a military campaign to defeat his opponents. He achieved his first successes in Spain, where he quickly defeated Pompey's troops. He then turned to Greece, where Pompey's main forces were located. The decisive battle took place in 48 BC at Pharsalus. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar managed to inflict a crushing defeat on Pompey's army. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on the orders of the Egyptian king Ptolemy X. Caesar pursued him to Alexandria, where he became involved in a dispute over the Egyptian throne. In this context, he supported Cleopatra VI, with whom he entered into a close political and personal relationship. After his return from Egypt, Caesar continued his campaigns to break Thellus' resistance of Pompey's supporters. In North Africa, he defeated the remaining followers of Pompey in the Battle of Thapsus in 47 BC. A year later, he defeated the last Pompeian troops in Spain at Munda. With the victory over his opponents, Caesar was the unchailing ruler of Rome. He was appointed dictator for life, and begging comprehensive reforms. These included measures to stabilize the economy, reorganize the administration, and expand civil rights. However, his increase in power caused discontent among the traditional elites who demanded a return to the old republic. This ultimately led to his assassination in 44 BCB by a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius. The assassination of Julius Caesar. The assassination of Gaius Julius Caesar on March 15, 44 BC, marked the dramatic end of his sole rule and ushered in a new phase of civil wars that ultimately led to the downfall of the Roman Republic. After his final victory in the Civil War against Pompey and his followers, Caesar had himself appointed dictator for life. His far-reaching reforms, including the extension of civil rights, the reorganization of the calendar, and the restructuring of the Senate, greatly strengthened his power, but it was precisely these developments that led to increasing resistance among the conservative senators, who feared that he would establish a monarchical rule. The conspiracy against Caesar was planned by a group of aristocratic senators who called themselves liberators. It was led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had once been close allies of Caesar, but now feared that his seizure of power would mean the end of the Republic. Other senators joined the conspiracy, so that the group eventually consisted of more than 60 people. On March 15th, the so-called Ides of March, the conspirators lured Caesar to Pompey's theater, where a Senate meeting was taking place. There they suddenly surrounded him and stabbed him with daggers. According to ancient historians, he suffered a total of stab wounds. According to legend, when he died, he was surprised and said in Latin or Greek, "You too, my son, Brutus." When he realized that this close confidant Brutus was also involved in the conspiracy, after the assassination, the senators fled in fear of Caesar's followers. But their goal of restoring the Republic proved illusory. Instead, civil war broke out. Again, when Caesar's confidants Mark Antony and Octavian, his adopted son and later the first emperor of Rome, claimed power, Caesar's murderers were eventually defeated. And a few years later, the Republic came to an end with the rise of the Principate under Augustus' Second Triumvirate. The Second Triumvirate was formed in 43 BC between Octavian, Mark Antony, and Marcus Aemilius Libevius. It was a formal and legally legitimate alliance that time to punish the murderers of Gaius Julius Caesar and secure control over the Roman Republic. Unlike the First Triumvirate, which was merely an unofficial power agreement, this alliance was officially recognized by the so-called Lex Tisiolae. After Caesar's assassination, chaos reigned in Rome. Octavian, who had been appointed Caesar's adopted son and heir, claimed his political suspicions. At the same time, Mark Antony, a close confidant of Caesar, and Lepidus, a high-ranking general, attempted to secure their own positions of power. Their common enmity towards the Republican senators, especially the murderers of Caesar, Marcus Junius, Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, ultimately led to their cooperation. One of the first measures of the triumvirate was to carry out prescriptions to eliminate political opponents and consolidate their rule. Numerous senators and wealthy citizens were placed on lists and executed or expropriated. Particularly notorious was the murder of the orator Marcus Tullius Cicero, a staunch opponent of Antony, was particularly notorious. In 44 BC, the decisive Battle of Philippi in Greece took place, where the triumvirate met the troops of Caesar's assassins. After all fierce battles, Brutus and Cassius were defeated, whereupon both took their. This marked the end of the Republican opposition, and the triumvirate was able to further expand its power over the Roman world. Despite their joint victory, the alliance soon began to crumble. Lepidus was increasingly marginalized and finally deposed by Octavian. Tensions grew between Antony and Octavian, particularly because of Antony's relationship with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. This ultimately led to the final break-in war between the two remaining triumvirs, which ended with Octavian's victory in the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. A few years later, Octavian became the sole ruler of Rome and established the Principate, with which the Republic finally transitioned into a monarchy. Battle of Actium. The Battle of Actium took place in 31 BC off the west coast of Greece and marked the end of the power struggle between Gaius Octavian, later Emperor Augustus, and Mark Antony, who was allied with the Egyptian queen Cleopatra. Octavian's victory not only meant the end of the Second Triumvirate, but also the final downfall of the Roman Republic and theories of the Principate. Tensions between Octavian and Antony have been escalating over the years. Antony, who operated in the East after defeating Caesar's assassins, had become increasingly estranged from Rome and lived in Egypt alongside Cleopatra. Together, they built up a strong military and economic base, which Octavian saw as a threat to his own power. Octavian also used Antony's close connection to Cleopatra for propaganda purposes, portraying him as a traitor to Rome who subordinated the interests of the empire to those of a foreign queen. In 32 BC, the Roman Senate officially declared war on Antony. To avoid the appearance of a civil war, Octavian, supported by his capable general Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, assembled a superior fleet and blocked his opponent's supply routes. Antony and Cleopatra, who were operating with a large but cumbersome fleet, attempted to break through the blockade and escape to Egypt. The decisive battle took place on September 2, 31 BC, near Actium. Octavian's fleet, which had more maneuverable and better manned ships, was able to corner Antony's forces. When the situation worsened for Antony, Cleopatra fled with her ships toward Egypt. Antony followed her, demoralizing his troops, who eventually surrendered. After their defeat, Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, where they committed suicide. The following year, when Octavian invaded Egypt, their deaths marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt, which became a Roman province. Octavian returned to Rome as the undisputed ruler and, with his skillful exercise of power, laid the foundation for the Roman Empire. The beginning of the Principate. In 27 BC, Gaius Octavian, who later took the title Augustus, reached the height of his political career and ushered in the beginning of the Roman Empire. After years of power struggles and political instability following the death of Julius Caesar and the subsequent civil wars, Octavian finally defeated all his rivals, including Mark Antony and Cleopatra. He was the undisputed ruler of Rome. The transition from the end of the Roman Republic to the beginning of the empire was a gradual process that was consolidated through skillful political maneuvers and symbolic acts of power. In 27 BC, Octavian officially handed over his power to the Senate and presented himself as the first titan of the state, marking the beginning of the so-called Principate. This title conveyed the illusion that the Republic continued to exist, when in reality, Octavian now wielded extensive political and military powers. He took control of the military, the right to legislate, and extensive powers in the administration, to legitimize his rule and give the impression that he was in harmony with traditional Roman government. Always emphasized his role as representative of the Republic and protector of its institutions. The title Augustus, which Octavianus gave himself in the same year, had a special meaning. Anabasiatic Augustus, meaning the exalted one or the venerated one, which referred to his special quasi-divine position at the head of the state. With this appointment, himself as the first Roman emperor, and was henceforth the symbol of the new political order. Although Augustus was officially only considered primus inter pares, first among equals, he retained full control over the essential political, military, and religious institutions of Rome. Despite the extensive power that Augustus had, He wanted to maintain the illusion that the traditional republican institutions were still functioning. He allowed the Senate, the popular assemblies, and the various offices to continue to exist, but under his control and with the Senate as a predominantly advisory body. In this way, Augustus created a system that differed from the old republic, but was designed to become a facade for the republican tradition and expand his power. The creation of the Principate brought a long period of relative stability and peace, known as the Pax Romana, which lasted for more than 2 centuries. Augustus understood how to use political reforms and a stable administrative apparatus. Under his leadership, the Roman Empire was expanded territorially, and he ensured the unification of law and administration, which shaped the empire in the long term. Despite the apparent continuation of republican elements, the emperor's power was henceforth unchilled. Augustus ruled the Roman Empire with a combination of political skill, military strength, and the clever use of symbolism. Through his long-standing influence on Roman politics, he created the model of the Roman Empire that was to last until the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD. Pax Romana. The Pax Romana, which lasted from 27 BC to AD, was an exceptionally long period of peace and prosperity within the Roman Empire. This era began with the reign of the first Roman Emperor Augustus and lasted until the death of Emperor Marcus Aurelius. It is often considered the golden age of the Roman Empire, during which empire flourished under stable government and no major military conflicts threatened its borders. The beginning of the Pax Romana can be traced directly back to Augustus, who, after the civil war and chaotic years of the Roman Republic, established a stable political order after assuming sole power as emperor. He was able to stabilize and consolidate the empire through a combination of diplomatic and military strategies. This included the unification of the law, the reform of the military, and the promotion of economic activities. Augustus understood how to strengthen the power of the emperor while at the same time giving the layers impression that the republican institutions would continue to exist. Through this balance of political stability and public legitimacy, he was able to build trust in the new imperial rule and lay the foundation for the long period of peace. A central element of the Pax Romana was control over the entire Mediterranean region, which was called Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Roman Empire stretched from Britain and Theuss to Mesopotamia in the east, and from Germania in the north to Egypt in the south. During this time, the Roman military was able to largely secure its borders, minimizing internal conflict, and minor threats were minimized. The Roman army was well positioned on the outer borders of the empire, and had an effective system of border guards known as limbs. This military presence prevented major attacks on the empire and secured the mountain passes and river valleys that served as gateways. Under Augustus' successors, this peace continued, with the emperors under Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero securing peace within the empire, even though the early years were marked by conflict and power struggles. This period saw a series of economic and cultural booms that affected not only the Roman capital of Rome, but also the provinces of the empire. Trade flourished, and cities such as Alexandria, Antioch, and Carthage grew into thriving commercial centers. Road construction and infrastructure projects promoted connections between the various parts of the empire and facilitated trade and communication. Culturally, the Pax Romana was also a period of prosperity. Roman art, architecture, and literature reached their peak, with famous figures such as the poet Virgil and the historian Tacitus writing their works. Roman architecture, by monumental buildings such as the Colosseum, the aqueducts, and temples, became the basis for many later Western architectural styles. These achievements helped spread Rome's cultural heritage beyond the empire and live on in the centuries that followed. Economically, the provinces benefited from increasing integration into the imperial market. This created economic cohesion, enabled the exchange of goods and raw materials across the vast distances of the empire. The agricultural sector flourished and urban centers grew as more people moved to the cities in search of work and better living conditions. Roman trade in luxury goods such as silk and precious stones from the east, as well as grain and olive oil from Egypt and North Africa, also contributed to prosperity. However, the period of peace ended with the death of Marcus Aurelius in 180 AD, one of the last Greek emperors of the Pax Romana. The succession, the invasion of barbarian peoples at the borders, and increasing political instability heralded the end of this stable era. Nevertheless, the Pax Romana remains as an extraordinary period of peace and prosperity in the Roman Empire. It represents a time when the empire reached its greatest extent and laid the foundations for the Roman legacy that would extend into modern times. Were Christians persecuted in the period from the 1st to the 3rd century AD? Early Christians in Rome and the surrounding areas experienced numerous persecutions. This period was marked by state rejection of Christianity, as the Roman rulers considered it a threat to the traditional religious order and political stability of the empire. The Christian belief, which did not worship the Roman gods and the emperor, as did not worship as deities, contradicted the Roman state cult, which was strongly based on worship of gods and the emperor as a god. The first period of persecution of Christians began under Emperor Nero in 64 AD after the devastating fire in Rome. Christians were accused of intentionally setting the fire, which led to the first systematic persecutions. Nero had numerous Christians arrested in the city and brutally executed. Many of them were killed in arenas as public entertainment by being thrown to wild animals to be eaten or dying in other cruel ways. However, this early persecution did not yet extend to the entire empire, as it was largely limited to Rome and the surrounding areas. In the following decades, the fate of Christians varied under 3 different emperors. Some emperors, such as Trajan, until after Christ, pursued a more pragmatic policy by not actively persecuting Christians, but they did not tolerate Christianity. Christians were expected to participate in the Roman state rituals, especially in the worship of emperor, which was impossible for many Christians due to their monotheistic beliefs. Those who refused to worship the emperor as a god were considered enemies of the state and sometimes also as troublemakers. The actual persecution escalated under the emperors Decius, 249 to 251 AD, and Valerian, 253 to Christ, who viewed Christianity as a serious threat to the Roman Empire. Decius introduced a general requirement to participate in religious state ceremonies, forcing Christians to make sacrifices to the Roman gods. Those who refused were considered enemies of the state and punished. These measures led to nationwide persecution, during which many Christians were sent into exile, tortured, or executed. Under Emperor Valerian, the persecution intensified, with Christian leaders such as bishops and priests being particularly targeted. However, the persecution of the 1st century did not only have negative effects on the Christian community, it also contributed to the faith gaining strength, as the steadfast attitude of Christians under extreme conditions attracted many followers. Those who sacrificed their lives for their faith became important symbols of Christian hope and steadfastness, and had a lasting impact on Christianity. Despite repeated persecution, Christianity was able to spread throughout the Roman Empire, thanks to its uniform teachings and organization, which was strongly based on the bishops and deacons, well able to survive even in times of persecution and to win new followers. The persecutions finally ended with the Edict of Milan in the decade after Christ, when Emperor Constantine I and Licinius legalized Christianity, thus bringing an end to state persecution. In the years that followed, Christianity gained increasing acceptance and eventually became the state religion of the Roman Empire under Emperor Theodosius. Urges at the end of the 4th century. Crisis of the 3rd century. The crisis of the 3rd century, which lasted from 235 to 284 AD, was a period marked by political instability, economic problems, and external threats that brought the empire to the brink of collapse. Political instability was one of the most prominent features of this era. After the death of Emperor Alexander Severus in 23 AD, a phase of almost continuous military power struggles began. During this period, there were almost 30 emperors, many of whom ruled only briefly and often came to power through violence or coups. This led to extremely high turnover among the rulers and constant uncertainty at the top of the empire. Many of these soldier emperors were elected by the troops, which led to military dominance and a weakening of traditional political structures. Military challenges were another significant factor. The Roman Empire was confronted with attacks and invasions from many sides. In the west, Thebarders were threatened by Germanic tribes, especially the Franks, and in the east, the empire fought against Sassanids, who were attempting to conquer the Roman province of Mesopotamia. These threats led to constant military conflicts that placed a heavy strain on the empire's resources and further undermined stability. Economically, the empire was also under enormous pressure during the crisis of the 3rd century. Pressure. The constant wars strained the state treasury, and the monetary economy increasingly ran into difficulties. In order to meet the financial demands, the Roman emperors began to reduce the silver content of the coins, which led to massive inflation. The value of Roman money declined rapidly, which undermined confidence in the currency and further destabilized the economy. Another significant aspect of the crisis was the increasing fragmentation of the empire into different regions. In the east, for example, de facto independent parts formed: the Gallic Empire from 260 to 274 AD in the west, and the Palmyrene Empire from 267 to 273 AD in the east, were attempts by regional rulers to take control of certain areas and break away from the center of the empire. Although these substates were able to serve temporarily, they contributed to the weakening of the empire as a whole and made reunification a major challenge. Despite the challenges, the Roman Empire managed to survive the crisis. A decisive turning point came with the reign of Emperor Diocletian, who ascended the throne in 284 AD. Diocletian carried out comprehensive reforms to stabilize the empire and strengthen the economy. He divided the empire into several administrative districts and introduced measures for tax collection and currency stability. In addition, he reformed the military and strengthened the empire's borders, which enabled it to ward off external threats more effectively. These reforms enabled Diocletian to stabilize the empire and thus lay the foundation for the later survival of the Roman Empire in the west and the continuation of the Eastern Roman Empire. Diocletian's Tetrarchy. The Tetrarchy that Emperor Diocletian introduced in 293 AD was an important reform model that fundamentally changed the administration of the Roman Empire. The aim of this reform was to curb the political instability that had shaken the empire during the crisis of the 3rd century, and to establish a more efficient government. By introducing a system in which 4 rulers reigned simultaneously, the control over the vast territories of the empire, and clearly regulate the question of succession. Diocletian recognized that the Roman Empire had become too large and too complex to be effectively ruled by a single ruler. To counteract this problem, he shared power with 3 other co-rulers. The Tetrarchy consisted of 2 Augusti senior emperors, 2 Caesars junior emperors, each of whom administered different parts of the empire. Diocletian himself ruled as Augustus in the east, while Maximian ruled as second Augustus in the west. Subordinate to them were the 2 Caesars, Galerius in the east and Constantius Chlorus in the west. Each of the four rulers was responsible for a specific part of the empire and was to take care of military defense, administration, and legislation in his territory. It was also planned that the two Augusti would abdicate after a certain period of time, whereupon the two Caesars would take their place and in turn appoint new Caesars. This system was intended to ensure an orderly succession to the throne and thus prevent chaotic power struggles that had frequently occurred in previous decades. The Tetrarchy had some significant successes. The administration of the empire became more efficient, as each ruler could concentrate on a clearly defined area. Military defense was also strengthened, as the emperors were closer to the threats at the borders and could react more quickly to attacks. Diocletian also carried out comprehensive economic and social reforms to ensure the stability of the empire. These included a tax reform, the introduction of fixed prices for goods, and the strengthening of the bureaucracy. Despite these advantages, however, the Tetrarchy system did not last. After Diocletian's abdication in 372 AD, power struggles soon arose between his successors. Instead of continuing the system in an orderly manner, rivalries developed between the emperors, which eventually led to new civil wars. Ultimately, the Tetrarchy was abolished by Constantine the Great, who reunited the empire under one ruler after several conflicts. Although the Tetrarchy did not last long, it was a decisive step in the development of the late Roman state. It demonstrated the need for decentralized administration and laid the foundation for later divisions of the empire, especially in the East. The administrative structure created by Diocletian enabled the Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, to assert itself later on, while the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century. Constantine the Great, who ruled from 306 to 337 AD Christ, marked the transition from pagan antiquity to the Christian Middle Ages and permanently changed both the political and religious structure of the empire. Two of his most significant achievements were the promotion of Christianity and the founding of the new capital, Constantinople, after the death of his father, Constantius Chlorus, in the year AD. Constantine was proclaimed emperor by his troops in Britain. This led to a power struggle with other rulers who also claimed the throne. In a series of wars and political maneuvers, he prevailed against his rivals. The decisive moment of his reign was the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 AD against his rival Maximinus. According to tradition, before the battle, Constantine had a vision in which he saw a Christian symbol and the words, "In this sign you will conquer." He then had his troops with the sign of the cross and won the battle. This victory strengthened his sympathy for Christianity. In the decade after Christ, Constantine, together with his co-emperor Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan, which granted Christians freedom of religion and ended the long persecution of Christians in the empire. He promoted the construction Christian churches, including the Lateran Basilica and the Old St. Peter's Church in Rome, and supported the church financially and politically during his reign. In 325 AD, he convened the First Council of Nicaea, at which important theological questions were clarified and the foundations of Christian doctrine were consolidated. In addition to his religious policies, Constantine also carried out significant political and administrative reforms. One of his most far-reaching decisions was the founding of a new capital for the Roman Empire. Rome had lost, and Constantine sought a strategically favorable location for a new metropolis. He chose the city of Byzantium on the Bosporus and had it extensively extended. In 330 AD, the city was officially inaugurated under the name Constantinople. It was designed as a new Rome and was equipped with magnificent palaces, churches, and administrative buildings. Due to its location between Europe and Asia, Constantinople developed into an important center of trade and power that remained the center of the Eastern Roman Empire for centuries. Constantine remained in power until his death in 337 AD. Shortly before his death, he was baptized, making him the first Christian emperor. His influence on Roman and European history was immense. Through his reforms and his support of Christianity, he laid the foundation for Christianity as state religion, which was finally accomplished under his successor, Theodosius I. He also created Constantinople, a city that remained the center of the Byzantine Empire for almost 1,000 years. His decisions not only influenced his contemporaries, but also shaped the history of Europe and Christianity until the modern era. Division of the empire. After the death of Emperor Theodosius I in 395 AD, the Roman Empire was finally divided into two separate parts, a western and an eastern part. This division marked a turning point in the history of the Roman Empire, as it led to the progressive weakening of the western part of the empire and the development of the Byzantine Empire in the east. Theodosius I, the last emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire, had united the empire during his reign, but he understood that the vast expanse of the empire and the different challenges it faced made efficient administration and defense difficult. After his death, the empire was divided. Empire fell to his two sons. Arcadius received the east and became emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, while Honorius ruled the west. This division was not only political in nature, but also had a profound impact on the culture, military, and economic development of the two parts of the empire. The western part, with Rome as capital, continued to suffer from constant attacks by barbarian peoples such as the Vandals, Goths, and Huns. These attacks finally led to the final fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, when the last Western Roman Emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic army commander, thus ending the era of the Western Roman Empire. The eastern part, with Constantinople as its new capital, experienced more stable development and was able to assert itself as an independent empire for a long time. Constantinople became an important center for trade, culture, and religion, and experienced a certain heyday compared to the West. The Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, was able to hold its own for centuries and lasted until the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans in 1453. The division of the empire after Christ was thus a decisive decision that significantly influenced the course of European history. While the West was unable to withstand the challenges of the migration period and internal political conflicts, the East managed to preserve its structures and become a cultural and economic power. This division contributed to the permanent creation of dual political entities whose paths diverged further and further over the centuries. The sacking of Rome by the Visigoths in 410 had marked a decisive moment in the decline of the Western Roman Empire under the leadership of Alaric, king of the Visigoths. Rome was sacked for the first time in centuries, shaking confidence in the invincibility of the Eternal City and accelerating the slow decline of the Western Roman Empire. The Visigoths were a Germanic tribe during the migration period in search of a safe haven because their own territory was threatened by the Huns. After initially serving as foederati, i.e., allies of the Roman Empire in the service of the emperor, the Visigoths under Alaric began to turn increasingly against the Roman Empire after their demands for land and supplies had been repeatedly ignored, and they had been pushed into the Roman provinces in the east and south. This eventually led to a conflict. Alaric and his troops besieged Rome in 408 AD and demanded high ransom payments and land allocations. After the Romanid Emperor Honorius had failed to meet these demands, the Visigoths continued their siege. In 410 AD, Alaric finally succeeded in conquering the city, which had until then been considered invincible. It was the first time in over 800 years that Rome had been conquered by a foreign army. The looting itself lasted 3 days and led to considerable devastation in the city. The Visigoths took valuable works of art, gold, silver, and other treasures with them. But unlike many of their lootings, this one did not involve the complete destruction of the city. Alaric showed a certain respect for the Roman population by sparing many buildings of historical and religious value buildings, although he robbed the city of its economic resources. The sacking of Rome had a profound impact on the Roman self-image and belief in the invulnerability of the empire. For many Romans, this event marked the symbolic end of ancient Rome, which in its heyday was considered the center of the world. Rome's moral and political authority was severely shaken, and the incident contributed to the further decadence and weakening of the Western Roman Empire. Although the Visigoths had sacked Rome, they did not remain in the city permanently. Alaric soon withdrew and eventually led the Visigoths to southern Italy. Nevertheless, the sacking of Rome by the Visigoths marked a decisive point in the decline of the Western Roman Empire. It highlighted the growing weakness of the empire and ushered in a series of further barbarian invasions that ultimately led to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD, is considered the symbolic end of the Western Roman Empire. This moment marked the final collapse of the Western Roman Empire, which had been a dominant power in the Mediterranean region for centuries. The process itself was less a dramatic military event than the result of a series of political and social upheavals that had been going on for decades. In the Mediterranean region, the process itself was less a dramatic military event than the result of a series of political and social upheavals that had been going on for decades. Romulus Augustulus was the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, but his reign was more symbolic than real, as he had little real power. In fact, he was an under-emperor who was influenced by his family and a clique of military leaders. At that time, the Western Roman Empire was already severely weakened, both by internal political instability and by external attacks from various barbarian peoples such as the Vandals, the Franks, and the Visigoths. The Roman army, which had traditionally been a pillar of the empire's power, was also severely decimated and was increasingly dominated by barbarian mercenaries who no longer felt any loyalty to the Roman state. The deposer of Romulus Augustulus was Odoacer, a Germanic military leader who served as commander of Roman troops in the empire. In the years prior, Odoacer had gained increasing influence in the western part of the empire as the center of power. In Rome continued to crumble. In 476 AD, Odoacer realized that the last emperor, Romulus Augustulus, no longer had any real political significance and seized the opportunity to take power into his own hands without any significant resistance. Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus and sent him into exile. It was a striking decision because instead of proclaiming himself emperor, Odoacer declared that he was subordinate to the Eastern Roman Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, thereby save himself the title of emperor, which meant that the Western imperial title was not formally abolished, but in practice, Western imperial rule was now over. Instead, the Western Roman Empire was now de facto a vassal state of the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Roman emperor in the East, Zeno, continued to hold theoretical satrapy. This step is often regarded as the end of the Western Roman Empire, as it marks the final absence of central Roman rule in the West. Although Odoacer's reign was seen by many as a temporary solution, the fall of the Roman emperor and the increasing dominance of the Germanic peoples in former Roman territories contributed to the emergence of new political structures that heralded the transition to the Middle Ages in Europe. Even though the Roman Empire continued to exist in the East under the Byzantines, the western part of the former world power was now history. The year 476 It has therefore become deeply engraved in the collective memory of history, not only because of the dramatic moment of the emperor's deposition, but also because of the symbolic significance of this event. The fall of the Western Roman Empire ushered in a new era in which the Middle Ages, with its various kingdoms, feudal structures, and Christian influences, whirled and laid the foundation for medieval Europe. The Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, represented the continuation of the Roman Empire in the East and survived the Western Roman Empire, which collapsed in 476 AD with the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor, while Western Rome collapsed after centuries of internal weakness and external attacks. Collapsed in 476 AD with the deposition of the last Western Roman emperor. While the Western Roman Empire collapsed after centuries of internal weakness and external attacks, the Eastern Roman Empire was able to continue to exist and even gain great political and cultural significance for a time. The Byzantine Empire developed into an independent, powerful nation that lasted more than 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, until the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. The beginning of the Eastern Roman Empire can be linked to the division of the Roman Empire in 93 AD. Emperor Theodosius the Great. After his death, his sons became rulers of the West and the East, with the eastern part of the empire, with its capital Constantinople, today's Istanbul, Constantinople, strategically located on the border between Europe and Asia, becoming a cultural, economic, and military center that upheld Roman traditions while at the same time developing in many areas. The city and the Byzantine Empire in general benefited from their proximity to trade between Asia, Europe, and Africa, and were thus able to continue building a strong economy. In contrast to Western Rome, which was destroyed by invasions of barbarian peoples such as the Goths, Vandals, and Franks, the Byzantine Empire was able to maintain military and political stability for a relatively long time, especially in the first centuries after the division, when the empire remained under rulers such as Justinian 527 to 565 AD. The Byzantine Empire remained an important power in the Mediterranean world. Justinian even attempted to restore the Western Empire by conducting major military campaigns that reconquered parts of the former Western Roman Empire, including North Africa, Italy, and southern Spain. However, these attempts at expansion could not be sustained in the long term, and after Justinian's death, the empire began to suffer territorial losses, especially against the Arabs and later the Turks. Despite these military setbacks, the Byzantine Empire was able to continue to exist by adapting to changing geopolitical realities and maintaining its role as a cultural and religious center of Christianity. Constantinople remained the spiritual center of the Orthodox Church, and the Byzantine Empire played a crucial role in preserving and passing on ancient knowledge, especially during the Middle Ages. Many ancient Greek and Roman writings were preserved in Byzantine monasteries and libraries and later transmitted by scholars to the Western world, contributing to the cultural renaissance in Europe. However, the Byzantine Empire also experienced repeated threats from external powers such as the Arab and later Ottoman Turks. In particular, the expansion of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries posed one of the greatest threats to the empire. The loss of large areas in North Africa and the Middle East to the Arabs led to a weakening of the empire, but Constantinople remained an unshakable bastion of Byzantinism. The decisive turning point came in the 11th and 12th centuries, when Byzantine power continued to erode. The Byzantines were unable to stop the advance of the Seljuks and later the Ottomans, and the Byzantine Empire suffered another dramatic setback when the Crusaders sacked Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade. This led to a temporary weakening of the empire and the formation of the Latin Empire, which lasted until 1261. However, The Byzantines recovered and recaptured Constantinople, continuing the fight against the Ottomans Empire, which lasted until 1261. However, the Byzantines recovered, recaptured Constantinople, and continued the fight against the Ottomans. The final conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans under Sultan Mehmed II in 1453 marked the definitive end of the Byzantine Empire. The city fell after a long siege, and the Byzantine Empire was absorbed into the new Ottoman Empire. Nevertheless, the legacy of the Byzantine Empire remains in many ways, particularly in the Orthodox Church, the art of architecture, and political culture, which were influenced by the Byzantine tradition and continue to be an important part of the history of the Eastern Mediterranean and Europe. The Byzantine Empire was therefore a fascinating remnant of the Roman Empire, which adapted itself repeatedly over the centuries in order to survive and exert a profound influence on European and world history. The Justinian conquests. The Justinian conquests in the 6th century AD were a series of military campaigns carried out by Byzantine Emperor Justinian Fapa from 527 to 565 AD with the aim of restoring the Western Roman Empire and reconquering the lost Western territories. These conquests were intended to restore the Byzantine Empire to its former glory and consolidate the emperor's power over the entire Mediterranean region. Justinian had the great goal of reuniting the Western Roman Empire, which had been lost in the 5th century due to the migration of peoples and barbarian invasions. He sought to preserve the Roman heritage and restore the territorial integrity of the empire, primarily by reconquering the western provinces, which had been under the rule of barbarian peoples such as the Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks since the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD, were under the rule of barbarian peoples as the Ostrogoths, Vandals, and Franks. The conquests under Justinian exemplified his ambition to continue the Roman legacy while strengthening the Byzantine Empire. The most important military campaign began with the reconquest of North Africa in 533 AD. General Belisarius, one of Justinian's most talented military leaders, led an expedition against the Vandals, who had controlled the area since the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Vandals had settled in North Africa and ruled over large parts of the region, including the important trading city of Carthage. After a series of victorious battles, Belisarius defeated the Vandals in 534 AD and integrated the area as a province into the Byzantine Empire. Following the successful conquest of North Africa, Justinian turned his attention to Italy, which was ruled by the Ostrogoths under King Totila. Belisarius began his lengthy campaign against the Ostrogoths, initially achieving great success and conquering important cities such as Rome, but the Ostrogoths were able to regroup under their new leadership and repelled the Byzantines in several battles. It took several years and the intervention of another Byzantine general, Nes, before the Ostrogoths were finally defeated in 553. Northgis was once again part of Byzantine Empire, which brought Justinian a significant victory. The last great conquest under Justinian was the reconquest of parts of Spain that were controlled by the Visigoths. This campaign began in 552 AD and was less successful than the others. Although the Byzantines managed to conquer parts of the Iberian Peninsula, they were unable to secure the territory permanently, and the Visigothic kingdom remained an important power in Spain until its final defeat in the 10th century. Spain. Despite these military successes, the burden of the wars was enormous. The constant fighting and the associated costs led to economic strain in the Byzantine Empire. In addition, the Byzantines were only able to maintain their conquests for a short time, as the Western were difficult to control due to their distance from the Byzantine heartland, ongoing internal instability, and increasing external threats from the Franks and later the Arabs. However, Justinian's conquests left a lasting mark. They significantly enlarged the territory of the Byzantine Empire and enabled Justinian to achieve his goal of restore the Roman heritage, at least for a short time. Their conquest of Italy in particular had long-term cultural and political repercussions. The Byzantine heritage in Italy, especially the introduction of Byzantine law and cultural influences, remained even after the Byzantine Empire lost the region. In the overall, Justinian's conquests were an attempt to restore the Roman Empire in its old form. But they were also a reminder of the enormous difficulties associated with controlling such a vast empire. Although the military success was significant, the long-term success of these conquests was limited, as the Byzantine Empire lost. The Byzantine Empire lost much of the conquered territory. Nevertheless, the period of the Justinian conquests remains a defining moment in the history of the Byzantine Empire and an important example of an emperor's ambition to preserve the ancient heritage.